Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with Sue Biniaz, referred to as the closer by the New York Times. Sue Biniaz is one of the most innovative legal minds in climate negotiations. As Deputy Envoy for Climate Change, her job is to be masterful of international legal policy, understanding of differing national circumstances, and capable of seeing the art of the possible. She has been at the forefront of global progress on climate from the start with the creation of the IPCC and the UNFCCC. In her current role, she has been responsible for rebuilding America's credibility on international climate issues following a previous administration's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. In addition to serving as a deputy climate envoy, Ms. Biniaz has continued to teach at Yale, Jackson School, helping to create the next generation of climate diplomats. Sue, welcome. It's a true pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much.
So take us to the beginning. How did it all start? How did you find your way to the State Department and the world of negotiations?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me, and happy to share my little journey into climate negotiations. After I graduated from law school and after spending a year with a judge in Los Angeles, who was actually the dean of USC Law School, I decided to go to the State Department because I was interested in sort of international law. I wasn't sure what that was, but it sounded intriguing. And the policy of the legal office was that you had to rotate every few years to a new subject so that you became kind of a generalist. So one of the interesting things I worked on was the International Space Station negotiations. We had to create a legal regime up in space, and that was amazing. And that ended, and I was looking around for, like, what am I going to do next? And the policy people came to me and said, we're trying to set up an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and we're not quite sure how to do that. It's a little complicated. It's going to be the child of two different international organizations, the World Meteorological Organization, the UN Environment Program. There's sort of different types of international organizations. You know, it's legally complicated. You know, would you mind figuring it out? So I thought, well, okay, that sounds interesting, although it had nothing to do really with climate change because it was more about international institutions. So we figured that out. We set up the IPCC, and the first thing that the IPCC did in its report was to sort of anticipate, because there was no negotiation of a treaty on climate change yet, but there was a chapter on if there were, hypothetically, a treaty on climate, what might the elements be? So I decided, well, I might as well do that since I helped set up this thing. And that was a really interesting negotiation, kind of a pre-negotiation of the first treaty. And, you know, one thing led to another. And after I did that, there was the actual negotiation of the first treaty. And I thought, well, might as well stick around for that. And then, you know, eventually, even though I did a million other issues at the State Department, I just kept my hand in the climate stuff. It was very addictive. And we ended up negotiating the Kyoto Protocol after that, and then some other agreements, ultimately the Paris Agreement in 2015. So that was kind of my history. Never expected to work on climate negotiations. Climate was not even a topic when I was in school. Mm-hmm. There was barely a course on environmental law, you know, domestic environmental law at the time. So you never know where you're going to end up.
Being at the right place at the right time.
Something like that.
Makes a big difference. So, of course, this symposium today is largely about climate and the solutions. Based on what you've seen in your career and this topic, what do you think are the most important tools for addressing climate change in terms of diplomacy, in terms of negotiations?
Well, I thought I might say, first, why is diplomacy important? And then, you know, how does it work? What are the tools? So, like, why do we need it? We need it because governments, I mean, it's a global issue, of course. It's trite to say that it requires global solutions, but it actually sort of does. Maybe not every country in the world, but at least the major emitters. So you have to get governments to agree on what the goals are that they're trying to achieve, and that requires diplomacy. And you also need governments to agree to take action to implement the goals that they agree on. And so it's kind of a level process of agreeing at the high level, what are we trying to do? And then like one notch below, maybe a lot of sort of bilateral diplomacy and trying to get countries to, step up their climate action. So, for example, when we were doing the Paris Agreement, we had to figure out what is the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. That, of course, required a lot of scientific input, but you also had to get international agreement of 200 countries or so to agree on the formulation of, we should try to make sure that warming does not exceed well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and, pursue efforts to 1.5. But then, so what do you do then? That's not good enough, really. So we sort of created this concept of nationally determined contributions, and those would be the emissions commitments of each country under the Paris Agreement. And, we had to use diplomacy to get countries to put in ambitious commitments and then figure out how they were going to implement them. So that's sort of the why. Why do we need diplomacy? The how. What are the tools? Well, advocacy is one of them. Like you want to make, just like you would in a debate or in a courtroom, you want to make good arguments for why countries should do the things that you're hoping they do. Leadership, was certainly one of the tools that the Biden administration came in. I guess it wasn't that difficult after the Trump administration to come in and be a leader on climate after, the walk away from Paris, et cetera. But, the Biden administration used a lot of sort of leadership type tools, pronouncements at the very beginning about climate being a top foreign policy priority, rejoining the Paris Agreement on day one. It was the very first thing that President Biden did was sign the instrument. And so that was sort of noteworthy across the world. What else? So linkages, country can say, if you do this, we'll do that. Maybe link it to something climate related, maybe link it to something that's not climate related. Obviously money, if a country has funds available to help other countries do the thing that you want them to do, that's obviously a really important diplomatic tool. There's sometimes negative tools. I'm not saying that we would use these necessarily as a matter of course, but countries do use those with other countries. They go out and they publicly say X country's not doing enough and it's kind of embarrassing, and so that can be a diplomatic tool. Mm-hmm. Also, you don't want to be accused of being the bad guy. So that's what I'd say on that topic.
That's fascinating, and I'm thinking about, so for those of us who don't on a regular daily basis do negotiations at the international level, how do you even approach that? I mean, you have a room full of, or auditorium full of 195 countries, and you're trying to reach consensus, and consensus is maybe an understatement because everyone has to agree. Because if even one country does not agree, then it doesn't go. I'm thinking about, we sit in a faculty meeting with 10 or 15 people. There's no way we reach full consensus on any topic, pretty much. How do you do this at international level, 195 countries? What are the tricks? How do you even start approaching that?
I thought about that when I was on a jury at one point. I thought, this is nothing, Well, it is really challenging, so I don't want to undersell how hard it is. It really is as challenging as it seems, and probably more so. You're right that consensus means it's a notch easier than what we call unanimity. Mm. Unanimity means everybody has to affirmatively vote yes for something, whereas consensus just means the absence of a stated objection. So you could object privately, and that wouldn't be a blocking of consensus. But if anyone says, like, I hate this, I object, you don't have consensus. So it is very hard as a matter of kind of process. And then if you add to that how fraught the climate issue is internationally, you can imagine how much harder it is to reach consensus. And we have countries from the very beginning, one of the biggest challenges has been that you have countries across the world in such diametrically opposed positions. Because you have some countries who would say that they're existentially threatened by climate change itself. If you're especially a low-lying small island, your land territory might actually disappear as a result of sea level rise. But the oil exporting countries would say they're existentially threatened by the responses to climate change, meaning the move away from fossil fuels. So how is it possible to come up with some kind of agreement that addresses the concerns of both of those types of countries? I often marvel that we reach agreement at all. Often students will look at what we quote unquote achieved and find all the loopholes and say but this part isn't legally binding and here there's a exception or this language isn't very tightly worded. And my perspective, I guess, having been through the process of trying to get 200 countries to agree is it's amazing to me that we reached agreement at all among countries that represent the entire world. I mean, one of the ways in which we're able to reach agreement is that these COPs, the Conference of the Parties that take place at the very end of each year, they're not the only thing. I think it would be impossible to reach agreement if you just marched cold into negotiating sessions at the very end of the year. They're kind of the culmination of the entire year. We've got meetings all year round at all levels, sort of technical levels, political levels, kind of laying the groundwork for what we're ultimately going to kind of hopefully reach agreement on at the very end. Countries put in national submissions along the way, so you will have a pretty clear idea along the way of what does everybody think about issue X, and you can start thinking about what are some of the what we call the landing zones, or the areas of consensus or the compromises at the very end. And also at the COP, you don't reach agreement, I don't think, very easily when you're in a session with all 200 countries, right? Because for one thing, everybody is facing forward, which is not it's not really conducive to reaching agreement when you're not looking at each other. And there are too many countries to be able to reach agreement because let's say country X says we think whatever, and I disagree, and I put my hand up and that I want to intervene at some point. There's so many countries looking to intervene that I might get my chance 3 hours later, in which case, it's completely interrupted. So you really need these smaller groupings on particular topics, and the way these COPs are organized, they will often pull apart smaller groups to meet in this room where you'll get representatives of groups, so you don't have 200 countries. They'll be sitting facing each other, which is really important. They'll only be talking about maybe one of the issues as opposed to 25 of the issues. So those are kind of some of the process techniques that are used to try to reach agreement.
And how do some other mechanisms feed in? And you probably touched on that already somewhat, but just to ask for more clarification. So we have, let's say, the G7, the G20, UN Secretary General's Climate Summit. Is there a temporal progression leading up to the COP?
Definitely. There's kind of a rhythm of the year, and it's relentless. I would say every week of the year, there is either a big meeting or you're preparing for the meeting the next week. It's kind of ridiculous at this point. The COP is at the end of the year, generally speaking, kind of November, December. So the rhythm of the year tends to be that all these other things take place during the year. And, maybe they sometimes have a purpose of their own. Countries can obviously get together and reach agreement on to do whatever. And it might be freestanding and have nothing to do with the COP or not necessarily feed into the COP. But a lot of these are aimed at creating momentum towards the COP at the end of the year. And that momentum might be in the form of language. It might be that the G7 or the G20 comes up with some kind of formulation on, let's say, fossil fuels that could be really useful. And they actually know it when they're agreeing on it, this might be something that will be useful at the COP at the end of the year. Or they could be reaching agreement on, actually reducing emissions. That would be another contribution to the COP. Because at the end of the day, at the COP, it has really multiple functions. Of course, one of the functions is to get the whole world to agree on words. And of course, it helps to have these, ideas of possible formulations kind of trickling out throughout the year. But it's also to reduce emissions, and the more you can create momentum throughout the year, whether it's a particular sector or, for example, I went to the negotiations at the International Maritime Organization, speaking of energy and transport. And, that was about 2 months ago. And so that sector reached agreement on a long-term, net zero goal, and also sort of the start of agreeing on measures to reduce emissions from shipping. That's 3% of the global emissions. And a year ago, we did the same thing with respect to international aviation. Mm-hmm. Those are both like contributors to the success of a COP at the end of the year, even though they're also freestanding outcomes.
Interesting. Speaking of the significance of the COPs, COP28 coming up. This is going to be a significant. They're all significant, but this is going to be associated with a milestone for the Paris Agreement, because it would be the first COP to assess progress towards the Paris Agreement, if I understand correctly, towards the goals of the agreement. So what would you say success will look like?
Okay, so what is coming up at this COP? When Paris was concluded, and that was in 2015, it had a temperature goal, again, of well below 2 degrees, striving for 1.5. And every country that joined put in its own nationally determined contribution, NDC for short, an emissions target. They weren't negotiated, they were nationally derived. That was the way we were able to get the whole world to come in. But if you added them all up, they didn't add up to well below 2 degrees. They added up to something like 2.7 degrees of warming as at least the initial tranche of NDCs. So there was a lot of convergence on the idea of, we can't just put in one set of NDCs and go home. We have to have multiple sets, and let's agree that we'll do them every 5 years, update them, and make them more ambitious. And the second idea was, let's also have a global review of how we're doing under the Paris Agreement every 5 years, and let's have that review. The word the Paris Agreement uses is inform the next round of the NDCs. So it was agreed that the first global stocktake would take place in 2023, which is upon us right now, and it will inform the next round of NDCs, which are due in 2025. So, one of the major things that's been going on this year is figuring out what is, there hasn't been a global stocktake yet, obviously, because this is the first one. So, what does it look like? It's supposed to cover all the topics of the Paris Agreement, not just what we call mitigation in our world, emission reductions. It's also supposed to cover adaptation, adapting to climate impacts. It's supposed to cover finance, which is, what kind of money is available for particularly developing countries. How are we doing in terms of aligning financial flows in the world more generally with net zero goals and decarbonization and all of that. And it's clear that it's going to be very kind of fraught as a negotiation. You would think it would be straightforward, right? Like you would sit down and you would very objectively say, well, what has our progress been to date? Let's take the temperature goal. You'd take IPCC reports of the International Energy Agency, and you'd say okay, we've done pretty well in this respect. We're on a much better temperature trajectory than we were before the Paris Agreement. Parties have done all kinds of things in terms of their NDCs. The outside world has done all kinds of things that are, quote, Paris aligned. But here are the gaps. We are still off track to keep 1.5 degrees alive or within reach, as we say. And here are the things we need to do about it. And you think that would be very straightforward. But it is the total opposite of straightforward. Some countries want to emphasize the positive without the negative. Yep. Some countries want to emphasize the negative without the positive. Some countries want to emphasize the gaps, but then not talk about what we should do. about it because they don't want to put pressure on themselves, or they want to say, here's what needs to be done, but it should just be the job of developed countries to do it, and kind of walk back from the kind of the Paris Agreement paradigm, which was to move beyond the division of the world between, developed and developing countries. So on every one of these issues, there's going to be questions of substance and questions of tone. And how do you get that right? It's important because it's the very first review. You're showing to the outside world whether the parties to the Paris Agreement are sort of capable of reviewing themselves in some kind of honest way. You're sending signals to the marketplace of where you think you are and what else needs to be done. But I think it's going to be very, very tricky, and it's something keeps me up at night.
So you touched on a question I was going to ask you, which is that many people would say there are articles here and there. You see that such negotiations, such agreements are just words. And that, what if these negotiations didn't happen? What if there weren't agreements? What would you say to that? What do you see as the impact of having these agreements done, the negotiations done, the agreements in place? What would have happened, do you think, if these weren't in place?
Yeah. You do sometimes hear people say, it's just words, which it always mystifies me, right? Because many important things are just words, right?
Indeed.
Every contract is just words. The Constitution of the United States is just words. But I might be a little bit defensive about that as a lawyer because my currency is words. So I try to remind myself it's not just about the words. So I think the words I would call them necessary but not sufficient. I mean, you have to have the words because they reflect intention of countries. And, if we didn't have the Paris Agreement written down, I think we'd be in a lot worse shape. So you can criticize it that we're not yet on track, and people say, oh, it's a failure. I wouldn't say it's a failure. I would say that, it's done a lot, but it has, we're not there yet, and much more needs to be done. But we are much better off with those words written down than without them. So, another thing, sometimes people will zero in on is, those words are fine, but they're not legally binding. Therefore, no one's going to pay attention to them. So who cares and why bother and all of that. But, the legally binding, non-legally binding kind of dichotomy is not as stark as it is in the domestic context. Here it matters a lot whether something's law or not law. But in the international world, you don't really have, you don't have jails and you don't have the same kinds of consequences and penalties for not doing the thing that you said you were going to do. So the sort of the delta between a non-legally binding commitment and a binding commitment in terms of what happens if you don't meet it is much smaller. In fact, it'll often end up being the exact same thing, which is what we call name and shame. Mm-hmm. It's embarrassing for countries to not have done the thing they said they were going to do, whether it's binding or not binding. And, so there's an incentive to do the thing you said you were going to do, no matter exactly how it's written down.
Right. Actually, along the same lines, you also hear somewhat negative comments or pessimistic comments about, if you want to call them, what about aboutism. For example, people would say, in the US, we go through all the trouble, all the money we invest at our own economic peril to limit emissions. All the wonderful discussions we had earlier today, the panels, everything that's going on to reduce our emissions. And then people say, then what about India? What about China? They're not doing anything about it. Doesn't matter how much we do, as long as they're emitting so much, we're doomed. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, you do hear that a lot. Sometimes it's, comes from sort of legitimate voices, which are saying wait a minute, if we're going to do a lot of emission reduction in the United States, we need to make sure that other countries are doing the same. Otherwise, ours is not it's not environmentally meaningful if it's just made up for with emissions from other countries. So it's true. Sometimes it's just a defense against doing anything in the United States, and it's just, others are not going to do anything, so why should we do anything? And it's just an argument to not take action. First of all, I think the administration would say, in terms of like the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, it's in the U.S. interest, like no matter what, in economically, environmentally, et cetera, to take kind of bold action on climate, quite apart from what others are doing. But on top of it, it's part of what our diplomacy is trying to get the major emitters of the world to reduce their emissions, exactly because the U.S. is at this point only about the 10% emitter of GHGs, so we're not really the problem at this point. China's almost the 30% emitter of greenhouse gases, and you don't really keep 1.5 alive without more action from China. So it's one of the things we've been, I'm on sort of Team China in our office, and we've been trying to work with them since the very beginning of the administration. And I was on Team China even, back in the day in 2014 when we reached the big U.S.-China joint announcement where we announced our 2 targets in anticipation of the Paris Agreement, and it was quite consequential. So, we're sort of hard at work on that score with India as well. One of the kind of processes that we use is it's one of the few bipartisan tools in the climate space. Under George Bush, the son, the White House invented this idea of getting the major economies of the world together. Because the theory was if you get about 20 countries together, they represent 80% of global emissions and 80% of global population, 80% of global GDP. And, yes, you have this UN forum with all the countries in the world, but on top of that, we really should be focusing in particular on these major emitters or major economies. And so they set up that group and started to discuss and sort of take action. And it's one of the things that President Obama kept going under a slightly different name. Still the major economies, but it's the Major Economies Forum instead of meeting. It's now the MEF. And it was kind of dormant during the Trump years, but it has been revived under President Biden. One of the campaign promises of President Biden was to host a leader-level Major Economies Forum within the first 100 days, and that actually happened. It was during COVID, so it was a virtual leader-level meeting, but I think it was another one of the symbols of this administration cares about climate change to have the first leader-level meeting be on, our subject.
Great. So I do have a couple more questions, if you don't mind, and I would also like to invite the audience, if you have questions, to start lining up by the microphones there. But I did want to ask you about what do you think is the role of IPCC going forward? Earlier today, we heard from Hoi-Sung Lee, former chair of IPCC. To what extent have the IPCC studies and reports guided your negotiations, and how do you think that's going to change? Or in either direction?
Yeah.
Is it going to enhance? What is the role?
The IPCC has been hugely influential. I mean, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, first of all, it was the IPCC report number 1 that said, here are the possible elements of a framework convention. So it obviously, influenced the very first treaty on the subject. And since then, the IPCC has had this completely sort of symbiotic relationship with the treaty process, so that whatever report comes out of the IPCC, that will be the subject of discussion at the meetings of the either the framework convention or whatever the successor agreement was, and it will definitely inform what the parties, decide to do. So, for example, in the Copenhagen Accord, which was one of the instruments in between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, that was the first time that there was a temperature, an actual number put in there of, at the time, 2 degrees. That came from reports of the IPCC. When the Paris Agreement decided on well below 2 and, striving for 1.5, again, sort of IPCC driven. One of the products of Paris was to ask the IPCC to do a report on 1.5 degrees. And that report, which came out in around, 2018 or so, it basically made super clear that even though people might think, how could there be such a difference between 2 degrees and 1.5? That seems like impossible. It made it clear that the difference is huge. Mm-hmm. And I think it really shook people up, so that when one of these COPs, the one in Glasgow a couple of years ago, essentially it didn't literally amend the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, but it made very clear that the thing we're now pushing for is 1.5 rather than 2 or some, variation on 2. So I think it's been, very, very consequential. Of course, the more consequential it gets, the more controversial it is to reach agreement in the IPCC. And you probably, those of you who are involved probably know that it's very difficult to get a report adopted, and there are lots of footnotes and reservations and things like that. I don't know about the future. It's hard to predict. Right, and you also, along the lines of some of the other questions that you very kindly responded to, when you talk about 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, to the average person, that may not really mean much. Even if you say 5 degrees, it's okay if it's 5 degrees hotter outside today or colder, how's that going to impact my life? So it's not necessarily something that most people would relate to on a daily basis, but we do see a lot of scientific literature, of course, has abundant evidence in it that all these climate numbers, variations, have a lot of environmental impacts that would impact our daily lives. We see wildfires. We see storms that have intensified, biodiversity impacts, plastics pollutions. How do you think we could better relate these things? Is there an opportunity here that we could leverage in perhaps achieving better results for your negotiations? Well, I think those of you who work on climate communications have a really important job to do. I think, not all scientists are equally gifted at explaining to the average person what their reports actually mean. So it's very important for them to be able to kind of dumb it down for the rest of us and say, these are the implications of our findings. If you actually open up an IPCC report, which I'm sure many of you have, they're almost impenetrable, even to those of us who work in this field. Low to medium confidence, medium, every sentence is sort of punctuated with how confident it is. It's very hard to even get through a draft of the IPCC. So it's really important for those of you, and I know some of you are in the audience, to help train scientists to be better at it, to make sure that newspapers get it right. It was very consequential when the New York Times was able to report, for example, that at 2 degrees, all coral reefs would be dead. Mm-hmm. That's something that actually, got people's attention. It's something everyone could relate to and was pretty horrified by, and it was a key difference between 1.5 and 2. So I think that field is a really important one, and something that, USC could obviously, does and should keep working on. Great points. I see several people lined up, so we'll alternate. So we go from this side, and then Yolanda, you'll be the second person. Go ahead, please.
I was just wondering, I've read that a slightly pessimistic view in climate negotiations is that oftentimes, because consensus is so hard to reach, that oftentimes the consensus that is reached is a least common denominator, so just the bare minimum of what everybody can agree to. So I was kind of curious about your thoughts of, do you think that's inevitable in climate negotiations? And I guess the second part of that question is, if that's inevitable, how do we make sure that that least common denominator is still something that can be effective?
Yeah, I don't think it really is the least common denominator, because there are a lot of countries that won't allow it to be the least common denominator. Often that's the small island states who will say, we're not signing on to a least common denominator, and they'll kind of flip the burden back on the countries that are against some kind of ambitious language. And so I don't, it may not be the highest level of ambition that one would want, but I don't think it's generally the least common denominator. The other important thing to note is that these COPs are always accompanied by there's not just the formal outcome of the COP, which is the consensus outcome. They are always accompanied by other initiatives and actions that are really consequential for reducing emissions. I call this the greater metropolitan COP, right? Because it's kind of surrounding the formal COP. It's just one example. The US and the EU, a couple of years, 2 years ago maybe, initiated this global methane pledge. Non-binding, total, it just takes the form of a declaration. Our office wrote it up in 45 minutes, thinking we really need some other thing to bolster this Glasgow conference. People are not paying enough attention to non-CO2 gases. Let's do something on methane. We came up with a number. The world should reduce methane by 30% by 2030, and then started calling around. And, started with 20 countries. Now there are about 150 countries signed on, and there's a lot of money going to countries to help them implement. And that is not a COP. It's COP related. Its genesis was sort of the COP, but it's not a formal decision. So when I look at the COPs, I'm always looking at this thing plus the other thing, and I think they have to be judged together.
We go to the other side.
Thank you both for the wonderful conversation. I'm Yolanda Gill from the Viterbi School of Engineering, so I have a question about technology for you. It may seem out of left field, but my question is, in the previous panel on transportation, we heard very exciting things about how technology has enabled really significant changes. So I have two questions for you. One is, if you look back, what technologies have facilitated or empowered certain paths forward that you had not expected or that were really exciting to you? And moving forward, what might be in your wish list? So I ask these questions so that you can help all of us developing technologies that can help in this space, that we continue to be motivated.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm no technology expert. I was the benefit of working on a team is turning to the person next to you on things you don't know anything about. But I would say, the renewables have changed everything. When I was working on the Kyoto Protocol, which the U.S. didn't end up joining, in the U.S., the reception to the Kyoto Protocol is basically almost entirely negative, except for this tiny little renewables sector. The only ones that thought, oh, this is actually in our interest. No one could have imagined back then how they would take over solar and wind and et cetera, would have taken over, the prices would have gone down. I think they are enabling people to think that maybe we could actually keep 1.5 alive. Also, carbon removal technologies are, of course, really important now. The IPCC is saying, something like 95% of their scenarios essentially rely on carbon removal. Direct air capture is going to be necessary after 2050 for sure. So those are the kinds of things we count on.
Mm. So we have 45 seconds for each of the two questions left. Okay. Go ahead.
I just wanted, if you could address the idea of the fate of the world is in your hands, so thank you for doing what you do. How do you sleep at night in trying to deliver this agenda that is sometimes maybe counter to you as a human being? You have to deliver the government, you have to deliver this negotiation. So just as a diplomat, what tools in your chest do you help you not just cave in?
Well, it is a pretty stressful job, I would say. I won't lie about that. Not because you're thinking every minute about the fate of the planet, but more it's you're thinking about all these challenges that I mentioned and how are we going to get through all those challenges. And there's so many different countries to deal with. So every day is this combination of figuring out sort of what we want, learning about where other countries are, trying to persuade them toward our point of view, trying to get allies, on this issue, even if they're not an ally on that issue, and like figuring out how all these pieces going to be put together in time for a decent outcome at the COP, on top of all the meetings that are happening, constantly on either a regional basis or on a particular topic or whatever. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it is pretty stressful, and sometimes I wonder, why am I doing this?
Well, because you're the closer. The last question.
Hi, I'll try to be real quick here. Thank you for being here, Ms. Biniaz. You're a total badass. You truly are. My question is, what's your advice or sobering message to someone like me who feel really jaded and are viewing these COPs with less optimism, when you see things like Coca-Cola being a major sponsor from last year's COP and being held in a location where there were some major human rights abuses going on, or this year's COP's president designate being the CEO of Abu Dhabi's national oil company, or when you see things like more fossil fuel companies than actual delegates from other countries, and barriers that I feel like countries that really matter, the most vulnerable, go through. It just seems like just taking a page out of Greta Thunberg's page, which is her blah, blah, blah.
Blah,
thing.
blah, blah. Yeah.
Right. So thank you.
Well, I'm not sure how to inspire you exactly. By the way, the COP designate, COP president, he actually went to USC. I don't know if I should share that. I told him I was coming to LA, and he's like, I love LA. And I was like, what's your connection to LA? And he said, I went to USC. And loves the place. So just to share that bit. Anyway, I don't think you can look at the COPs as entirely negative. For example, speaking of the vulnerable, last year it was agreed to come up with funding arrangements, including a new fund for loss and damage for countries that, when adaptation doesn't work anymore and there are actual kind of losses and damages, what happens? People need help. So it was agreed to put together a fund for the particularly vulnerable countries, quote unquote, and that's going to happen at this COP. So that's something that people should feel good about. It would never have happened without the pressure of a COP, and people are working on it furiously. It's supposed to come to conclusion this week. We're on the phone 24/7 to try to make that happen. So that's a good thing. In terms of whether an oil state should be the host of a COP, there have been a lot of negative press about that. In some ways, we'll see, like as Secretary Kerry will say, the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see. But in some ways, they have more ability to call together oil companies to try to take on commitments than a small island might. Fiji was the president of the COP a few years ago. It would have been hard, I think, for Fiji to rally the kind of commitments from oil companies that the UAE is currently trying to do, at least. So we'll see. Also, you need to keep your spirits up. I think always need to focus on these other initiatives that don't require, it's the consensus that really puts something of a limit on each one of these the formal aspect of each COP, because you have to imagine, are really 200 countries going to agree to that? But then be inspired by the things that are going on the outside. For example, we have a cool initiative called the Green Shipping Challenge. Speaking of transportation, where we've been setting up all these green shipping corridors between Port A and Port B. There's one that's been agreed between Los Angeles and Shanghai, between Singapore and Rotterdam. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on in the world. You're not going to see that in the formal outcome of the COP, but always pay attention to the things that are going on the outside. They may have, 120 countries involved rather than 200, but, so what?
Well, thank you very much, Sue Biniaz. Real pleasure
Thank you.
to have you here. Okay.